righty. So we are on
8.
We're actually at Mark chapter 7. Did we do the healing of the, no, deaf and dumb man? Okay,
No.
so we're at Mark 7:31. Now as we go through this, all the way through the feeding of the 4,000, let's remember what happened, this transition in chapter 7 that we see going on. Remember, Jesus was attacked, right? Not attacked, but his disciples were accused of not following the traditions of the elders. All right, Jesus then teaches that these traditions often contradict God's word and the intent or the spirit of the law that's been given. He then says what ultimately defiles us. It comes from our heart. That's a really difficult teaching because we'd like to say the devil made me do it. All right, but we actually carry this in our fallen, broken nature. Right? All this ties us perfectly together with Genesis. Genesis is all the way through. The nature of children of Adam is fallen. We're going to do a baptism today, which recognizes the nature of children of Adam are fallen. And that not even cute little Liam, who's his real wonderful young 3-year-old, actually in his own nature has the ability to get to heaven. Okay? All right. Then last week we had the Syrophoenician woman. And if we remember the Syrophoenician woman, she had the demon-possessed daughter. Jesus then does his teaching, right? And basically he's teaching what? That the Jew is going to come first and then the Gentile. So this is the salvific plan. The Jews come first. Why do they come first? Well, that's what God promised. That's what God is doing. That takes all of salvation of what Jesus does on the cross and puts it in the context of the history and the law. All right. And we learned, that we have to come to God with humility and faith and persistence. But notice now Jesus goes and he returned from that region of Tyre and Sidon, and he went through Sidon, the Sea of Galilee, and he's in the region of the Decapolis. The Decapolis that's verse 31. Let me read through the whole thing. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hands on him, and taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers in his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, which is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute to speak. All right. So, we're in this transition. He went up into a Gentile area. He's coming back down. He's heading over into Decapolis. All right, Decapolis is along the Sea of Galilee, but the Decapolis represents 10 cities. By the way, I don't remember. I think it was Rome. Set up some of these cities and set up this group of people that if Israel ever revolted, these people would fight against Israel. So when you hear Decapolis, realize it's not well liked by Israel, all right, at this time. And then, therefore, it's also filled with, guess what? Those nasty Gentiles. All right, so all those nasty Gentiles are in there. Now remember what he just said, the Jew first, but you see him recapitulating what he did. All these healings that he did, has he not done before within Israel? So often prophets will live out the prophecy.
So he stepped
So
up.
you're seeing him in real life, a prophetic movement, you know. So the prophets often do things. If you think of some of the things that Jeremiah had to do, he would build a siege, he would lay down by it, he had to do all these, you know, he's doing things in the physical that is proclaiming what God is doing, so to speak, in the spiritual, or what he's going to do. All right, so Jesus shutting down the temple is a prophetic act that most people miss, because we'll get to that later. But why does Jesus shut down the temple? Remember when he overturns the money changers and all that, and everybody says, oh, that's just, he's mad about them making money. He's mad about them making a profit on God, which he probably was. That may be a subtext, sort of a sub-understanding of it. Why did Jesus overturn the tables at the temple? Does anybody know? Okay. If you overturn the money tables, then people can't. The money tables were, you brought in your Roman money, which had whose image? Caesar's. Can you bring that image into the temple? No, you can't even bring it into the temple courts. So you exchanged it for temple money. And then the temple money, you could go in and buy your sacrifice, and then your sacrifice could be sacrificed to Yahweh. All right? If you stop the money changing, what else do you stop?
People don't worship.
Literally the sacrifices of the temple. So he literally causes the temple to stop business for a day, or for every time it takes them to. That's a prophetic act. What's he prophesying? You know, that he uses Jeremiah, you know, that God's judgment is coming on that very structure, you know. And so these are actions. All right. So he goes to Decapolis. All right. So he's once again in a more, it's in Israel, but it's more, or in Samaria, it's more it has a more Gentile feel to it, and a lot more Gentiles there. Now here's an important thing about when did the last time Mark mention Decapolis? All right, we have to go back a little bit. We got to find it. Okay. In Mark chapter 5, Jesus, if you remember, crossed over, ran into a demoniac man. He cleansed the demons out of the demoniac man, sends them into the pigs, and the pigs go into the water and all die. All right. And then the people, where did this take place? Around Decapolis. The people then, when they see this, what's Jesus' reputation? Bad. This is a bad man. Look at what he just did to our economic system. He just threw a huge wrench into, think of the money lost with 5,000 pigs. All right? In a nation that food isn't all that plentiful. All right? What were you going to say, Pat?
Is that why they don't eat pork?
No, well, of course, that proves also that the region is Gentile, right? Because that pork would have been for who?
For the Gentiles.
For the Gentiles, yeah, you know. So the reason they're not allowed to eat bacon is to make them jealous. I'm sorry, it's a joke. Okay, now remember the demoniac man said, Jesus, let me follow you. That, by the way, would have been a horrible PR move by Jesus, right? Hey, look at this crazy, you know. Okay, anyhow, so Jesus tells them in chapter 5, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how much mercy he has on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis. So where is he? So this demoniac man is, some would argue he's one of the first, so, you know, almost like apostle, right? Or certainly evangelist, because he goes and he listens to Jesus and he just goes around telling people, this is what Jesus did for me. This is what Jesus did for me. Now Jesus gets back to Decapolis. How are things changed? They were yelling at him to get out of Dodge. Now what are they doing? They're bringing people for healing. So you see the power of testimony, brothers and sisters. Power of telling the good news. The power of telling what God's doing. Even if it's just, it doesn't have to be as sort of wow value as I was blind and now I see. But just to talk about how God's presence is helping you through difficult times. Take whatever witness you have, your encounter with God, and talk about it. And that's all he expects, okay? Okay. So they brought him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. All right, and they begged him to lay hands on him. All right. So one thing we recognize is this man isn't brought on his own accord, is it? He doesn't, could a deaf, blind, he's not blind, he's deaf and mute, or he has a speech impediment. Could be that, he's been deaf from birth and so he just doesn't talk right, or he may have problems with that part of his brain also. Okay, but notice it says they, all right, bring him. Now remember, some people come to Jesus on their own. Sometimes Jesus comes to the person, but we hear story after story where some bring people to Jesus. For example, remember the paralytic who they lowered through the roof. If you read that carefully, he gets lowered through the roof and Jesus sees their faith. Notice that faith seems to be indicating it doesn't say he saw the faith of the paralytic. It says what? He saw the faith of the one lowering him. Isn't that fascinating? So don't underestimate the power of your faith, right? In bringing people to Jesus. All right. So we have testimonies of God using others to bring them to encounter him. And that's a faith statement as we bring people into them. So it's they. All right. And we also notice there's a crowd. All right. So what does that say about the preaching of the healed demoniac man? It worked. All right. There's a crowd. So, but what does Jesus do?
Took him aside.
And taking him aside from the crowd privately. So Jesus isolates. Now this, once again, and he gets, in the end, he heals them, and then what does he tell them? Don't tell anybody. Okay. Fascinating, right? Because once again, we got a person who's never been able to talk. He's heard about it because somebody what? Talked. Jesus sent the demoniac man to do what? Talk about him. Now he's telling them to not to talk about him. All right. Now this once again has to do with the messianic secret. This is because at this particular time, the people know about him. If it grows too big, all right, it can cause problems. So, remember, Jesus is less concerned with the crowd, right, than his disciples. All right. So he's training the message goes forward with who? The disciples, the apostles. Okay, he's got to get them ready for the work. So he's getting these teachings in there over and over and over again. All right. Believe it or not, Jesus didn't do probably a new sermon every time he went to a new region. That would have been too much for the disciples to hold. So he kept teaching it over and over again because the crowd hasn't heard it yet. It's not that he's not original, it's that part of him teaching the crowd these basic sermons is so the apostles, hearing them over and over and over again, will know how to, speak to. Not unlike our call to what? Remember what Christ did for us in the Eucharistic feast. Every week we have to hear it over again, over again, over again, so that we would understand it, okay? All right. So he takes him aside from the crowd privately. He puts his fingers in his ears. So once again, I don't know whether this was common in that day and age. Most people in that particular period of time, if you had a defect, they would fear it because it would be a curse from God. So if you're deaf, I don't want to get anywhere near your cursed ears. Okay? Does that make sense? It's sort of like touching the leper. All right, so one of it is Jesus' grace of touching the very thing this man thinks is cursed from God. So God touches that which he, believes is cursed. All right. Jesus touches that which nobody would want to touch. All right.
They didn't consider that unclean like they would do the leprosy, right?
No, I don't think. Yeah, leprosy because leprosy was an infectious disease. Very clear. A lot of. By the way, the not touching went to any skin disease that was considered contagious. We just group it under one term, leprosy. You could almost just say any contagious skin disease. Okay. So, but still, he then he spits and touches his tongue. So he literally. Now that sounds gross to us, right? I don't know how that was in that tradition back then, but once again, this shows us one. Every time we see these healings, does Jesus always do it the same way? No. This is to prevent us from thinking we can do it through a mechanical. I just have to follow a process and not a relational means. All right. Jesus looks and sighs. All right. This can be interpreted almost as an angry, But then the question is, who's he angry at? Could be, the lack of faith. Could be that people suffer. Could be, the very fact of the fall. But then he simply commands. All right. So here we have him. Now he's not delivering him from a demon. Right. He doesn't cast a demon out. Right. He simply commands what? Be open. Be opened. All right. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. So this is the first time he can actually speak. All right. Also, we have to remember the context of this is sort of a Gentile area, and Jesus has been in his encounter with the Pharisees. Remember, he says, "What? This people honors me with their what? They're speaking, but their hearts are far from me." Jesus will say to the Pharisees in the other Gospels, "You could see, but because you deny me, you're now blind. And yet now, and those who didn't know me are what? The blind are seeing." So we always have to take these things not just in the physical sense, but the spiritual sense. All right. And then he charged them, Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. Okay. Part of this also is, remember Marcus writing to a persecuted community. Okay, we'll get this more towards the end. So the temptation of the community that we can infer from Mark is, guess what? If you're under persecution, what do you want to do? Okay. And so part of what this is irony. In other words, these people, even though they're told to what? Shut their mouths, are going around speaking openly, even in a dangerous atmosphere for them. All right. And yet the church is doing what? All right. How many in the church just don't want to share anything about Jesus? Why? Well, we're afraid, or we don't know what to say, or was the demoniac man properly educated in theology before he was put on his missionary tour? No. What did Jesus command him to do? Go tell everybody what the Lord has done for you. That's it. All right. And so we have this sort of irony that, Jesus tells people, don't say anything, and they say something. And then he tells us to what? Go tell everybody. And we what? We don't. All right. And we'll see this in the resurrection chapter, in chapter 16. Okay. And they were astonished beyond measure. He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now we have to recognize that Jesus is fulfilling then prophecy. All right. I didn't write down the exact one. I forget it right now. But, you know, when we look at the, like the, they shall build, you know, darn it. The Spirit of the Lord proclaim the liberty. Oh, well, I'll find it later. Anyhow, he has done all things. So to make the deaf hear and the mute to speak is from the prophets. You should recognize Jesus is the Messiah. In other words, this is all evidence of messiahship of Jesus. All right, and even in the midst of these Gentile regions, they're beginning to recognize it. All right, I'm not going to jump in. I'm going to do the feeding of the 4,000, but you all talk too much. So we'll continue. So we'll do chapter 8. A lot of the teaching about the feeding of the 4,000 is pretty synonymous with the feeding of the 5,000. So we'll be able to get through that one pretty quick. And then we'll try to get into the leaven of Pharisee and Herod following that. All right. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thank you.
Thanks be to God. Hallelujah.